Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. We start business this morning with general questions. Our first question from Emma Harper.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of its commitment in the programme for government to decarbonise the rail network, when the Dumfries and Stranraer lines, when will they be upgraded to reduce emissions and improve journey times?
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, last week this Government committed to putting plans in place to decarbonise Scotland's railway by 2035. Transport Scotland will set out details and actions in spring 2020. We also committed to identifying opportunities across the rural rail network in the South West, drawing on the successful approach adopted on the line north of Inverness to exploit the value of those lines for the benefit of local communities and the wider economy. That work will include the prospect of line speed improvements and the review of service patterns, and I expect this investigation to report by the autumn of 2020.
Emma Harper.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Constituents and businesses regularly contact me with their concerns and frustrations over the journey frequency and times on both of these arterial routes, and they feel that it acts as a barrier to attracting people and investment to Dumfries and Galloway. Can the Cab Sec therefore provide me with assurances that the Government is committed to improving the Stranraer and Dumfries lines, both to improve passenger satisfaction and to reduce emissions on the diesel lines, particularly given the climate emergency rightfully declared by the Scottish Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, as we discussed the Rural Economy Committee just yesterday, this is an area where the Government has set out its ambition to decarbonise the rail network. Part of that will be further electrification, but we're also looking at alternative propulsion methods, including battery and also hydrogen cell. And we're in advanced discussions with a range of parties on looking at the prospect of bringing in such types of train systems into the Scottish network, which we'll be taking forward over the coming months. But I can give the member the assurance that she's looking for, that the work that we are commissioning to look at how improvements can be made, which should report by the autumn of next year, is to specifically address the very concerns that the member has raised on behalf of our constituents.
And Finlay Carson to be followed by Colin Smith. Finlay Carson.
In November last year, I raised the closure of the airline to Stranraer with the First Minister, asking if better contingency plans would be put in place to avoid disruption in the future. I was pleased that the First Minister took that undertaking to ensure no disruption in the future. Given that there's still ongoing works at the Air Hotel and with electrification now being mooted, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that those contingency measures are in place?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Presiding Officer, as was mentioned at the time, Network Rail and through Transport Scotland put a considerable amount of effort into addressing the issues about the Air Station Hotel, which was causing an impact on the line. I know that the Council are also seeking to have action taken forward in relation to the condition of the hotel itself, but I can assure the member that there is ongoing work in looking at how we can continue to help to protect the line should anything unforeseen develop in the future. As you would expect, that's something that's always considered within the rail network. And as I mentioned to Emma Harper, a key part of what we're looking at is not just electrification, but also looking at alternative propulsion systems for trains, which includes the hydrogen cell and also battery trains, which allows us to then look at removing the diesel trains from the network. So these are all issues which are being looked at and will be part of the work which we'll continue to take forward as part of our decarbonisation of the rail network.
And Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, battery and hydrogen trains are better than diesel trains from an environmental point of view. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that the Nith Valley line from Glasgow to Dumfries through to Carlisle is actually an increasingly important line as a diversion from the West Coast main line, and therefore only investment in that track and electrification itself would actually allow those trains that use the West Coast main line to be diverted onto the Nith Valley line and run at speeds that they can currently run on the West Coast main line? Or we'll simply have the scenes that we had during the Beast from the East, where the Pendolino trains from the West Coast were crawling along the Nith Valley line because of the lack of investment in the track itself.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, as I mentioned, the work that's now been undertaken by Network Rail to look at the improvements that can be made on the line will all form part of our thinking about what further investment will be made into this particular route, including looking at the potential for electrification or looking at alternative types of trains which can be used on it other than that of diesel trains. These are all matters that will be looked at. What I'm not going to do is jump to a conclusion as to what will come from that report, but I'm sure the member will welcome the very fact that we are looking at what further investment can be made into this particular route in order to help to improve journey times and also reliability on the route.
Question 2 has not been lodged. Question 3, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government what it's doing to support Highlands and Islands businesses experiencing losses due to cuts in rural banking services.
Minister Kate Forbes.
Well, I certainly recognise the ongoing need for businesses in the Highlands and Islands to have access to banking services, particularly to withdraw and to deposit cash. The UK Government has legislative and regulatory responsibility for banking and financial services, and despite representations from the Scottish Government and from MPs and MSPs right across the political spectrum, the UK Government has made clear that it will not intervene in branch closure decisions. I have been continuing to engage with the banks and other stakeholders, pressing regulators, banking providers and the UK Government to ensure that local banking service, in particular access to cash, remains accessible.
Rhoda Grant.
Businesses that deal in cash are especially vulnerable because there appears to be an increase in break-ins surrounding those types of businesses. That's costing them financially, but it's also impacting on business confidence. I wonder what the Scottish Government is doing to protect and support these businesses that are vulnerable to break-ins.
Minister Kate Forrest.
The member raises a very good point and practical advice on how to develop business crime reduction and prevention strategies is carried out by the Scottish Business Resilience Centre, which has received grant funding from the Scottish Government. There's also work going on with the banks themselves, particularly through the Banking and Economy subgroup of FISAB, to ensure that between government and banks we give businesses the security that they need when it comes to dealing with cash.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Minister will be aware, there are currently no bank ATMs between Ullapool and Thurso. Can the Scottish Government confirm if they are in discussions, as I am, with banks to try and rectify this?
Minister.
I have been in discussions. I've had meetings with Link, for example, and the payment services regulator to look at how we ensure that there is that access to cash. And the member will be aware that there is a strategy in place just now to look at where an ATM does not have any other ATMs within a certain parameter, that ATM is preserved. But there's far more work that needs to be done, and I think working across parties to put pressure on the regulator and on the government itself is quite important.
Question number 4, John Mason.
To ask the Scottish Government when the guidance on the Scottish Housing Quality Standard will be reviewed.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Everyone deserves to live in a warm, safe and affordable home. And for the social sector, the Scottish Housing Quality Standard is crucial to delivering that. I made a commitment to John Mason in May that any review of the guidance on the standards would consider the recommendation for 5-year electrical safety inspections, and I'm happy to reiterate that today. There's a range of activity currently already underway that will improve or has already improved the Scottish Housing Quality Standard on safety, fire safety and energy efficiency standards that are now being adopted by the social housing sector.
John Mason.
I thank the Minister very much for his tone and for answering that. I just wonder if he could be any more specific on the timing of a review of any guidance and when we might see a 5-yearly inspection brought into the social rented sector.
Presiding Officer, standards in different tenures have evolved separately over time, as Mr Mason is well aware. A review looking at improving consistency between tenures concluded with recommendations of the Common Housing Quality Standard Forum. And we've already started making some identified changes to the repairing standard. And we're also currently reviewing the tolerable standard, which applies to all housing in Scotland. The few changes that were recommended for the Scottish Housing Quality Standard included that requirement for 5-year electrical safety checks, which is already best practice within the sector. Any further changes to the SHQS will, I'm sure Mr Mason will understand, will be undertaken with close liaison with partners in the social rented sector, and that process itself will determine the timing of changes to the standard. But Mr Mason can be assured that I will continue to keep him in contact with him to let him know exactly how we're going to move forward in that front.
And Graham Simpson.
Thank you. Can the Minister tell us when this month he'll be responding to the recommendations of the Tenant Maintenance Working Group, and whether that will be in the form of a statement to Parliament or some other way?
Minister.
I cannot confirm how that will be related to Mr Simpson at this moment in time, but we will respond as we said that we would, and I'm happy to talk to Mr Simpson about this after question time today about how we will move forward in that front.
And question number 5, Claire Baker.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what action was taken during the summer recess to secure contracts and future employment at BiFab.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
The Scottish Government continues to work collaboratively with BiFab's majority stakeholder and shareholder DF Barnes in pursuit of a strong future pipeline of works for the company, with the aim to secure and deliver future contracts and increase employment opportunities. And Claire Baker was one of the members that was in attendance at a very helpful briefing I had with members with an interest in BiFab.
Claire Baker.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. This Saturday in Kirkcaldy there will be a Fighting for Our Future march and rally with the BiFab workforce, the local community, trade unions and supporters. The workforce and the people of Fife are throwing commitment and determination to bring jobs to Leavenmouth. It is important that all who have a stake in the future of BiFab work together. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what preparations are in place for the next offshore wind supply chain summit and when that will be?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think those are very helpful points, and I appreciate the efforts of all politicians to try and help the government in pursuing work in that regard. We are proposing to take forward a range of actions that I discussed at the last summit, also to challenge the UK government around contract for difference as well. There have been investment decisions that are welcome, but crucially we must secure some contracts that will lead to the positive benefits and expansion and growth for BiFab. So there's a range of actions underway. I'm happy to provide a further briefing, but working very hard to secure contracts here and now. I think it's an important point to make, Presiding Officer, that we mustn't confuse a campaign for work with poor industrial relations, because actually industrial relations are really strong with the workforce, with trade unions, with management, as we try and secure work for BiFab yards.
Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update further to his ongoing discussions with the UK Government as to when the UK Government will act to address the failings of its contract for difference process, where regrettably we see no conditionality, which would of course support indigenous supply chain companies such as BiFab?
Secretary.
Annabel Ewing's absolutely correct to say if there was a change in the CFD process, it would be materially significant to the outcome and the prospects of the UK and the Scottish supply chain, and that would be really important to BiFab. UK Government could make that decision. They haven't made that decision. They are reviewing the CFD process. I don't have much more to offer at this time. We're trying to get progress from the UK Government in that regard, but they seem somewhat distracted on many other matters. But it is a matter of priority for this Government, could make a difference, and that's why we'll pursue a process that would allow conditionality that would ensure work can and it will come to Scotland if the UK Government made that decision around contract for difference.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was very pleased with the partnership BiFab recently announced with Lewscastle College, which will see new engineering training opportunities and work placements at Arnish. A complaint I often heard from workers at Arnish prior to the takeover by DF Barnes was that no training or apprenticeships were being offered, and this is an especially important issue given the older age profile of the workforce. So does the Minister agree that in order to keep the yard sustainable and to maximise local benefit, it is vitally important to ensure that young people have access to training opportunities such as these?
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely agree with Alistair Allen's comments there, that we want to secure that pipeline of work that will further enhance the job numbers and the opportunities for training apprenticeships within as well. I welcome that collaboration, and that's why we're focused on securing those contracts so that it can lead to further positive benefits for BiFab and particularly Arnish and other sites who will benefit from those opportunities.
Question number 6, Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the potential impact on the egg production sector of a no-deal Brexit.
Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, unfortunately, our assessment is that the egg production is another of our successful food and drink sectors that will be negatively impacted by a no-deal Brexit. And this is particularly true if, as expected, the UK Government leaves the sector without the protection of tariffs or quantitative restrictions on egg products coming into the UK. That would leave Scottish producers at an unfair disadvantage, with the potential for imported products of much lower quality and welfare standards flooding the market here.
Jim McAlpine.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and I have many concerns about this because I have a number of major egg producers in my South of Scotland region. Does he share the British Egg Industry Council's concern that a no-deal Brexit threatens the provenance of Scotland's egg production and the quality of the food we all eat because of the risk of eggs produced under much lower welfare standards entering our food chain? And can I ask what the Scottish Government is doing and what it can do to protect our producers and reputation for high welfare egg production?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do. It beggars belief that the reckless approach by the UK Government to allow complete trade liberalisation in the egg production sector could wipe this out in one fell swoop. Not only will it leave our hard-working egg producers unprotected and vulnerable to cheaper imports, but could also lead to consumers unwittingly eating egg and egg products produced to a lower welfare standard than we do, thanks to being members of the EU. Now, these issues, to answer Ms McAlpin's question, these issues were raised with DEFRA ministers on Monday. But yet again, presiding officer, they were completely unable to give us any reassurance whatsoever to alleviate these real and practical concerns. It was completely inadequate and utterly shambolic.
Question number 7, Rhoda Mackay.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to expand the HPV vaccination programme to include teenage boys and young men.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
Boys in S1 will be offered the HPV vaccine from this academic year, 2019-20. Uptake for the HPV girls vaccination programme continues to exceed 80%, and we know from the evidence and the recommendations made by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation that extending the programme to include S1 boys will help reduce diagnosis of HPV-related cancers and save lives in years to come. The HPV vaccine has also been available to men who have sex with men up to age 45 through sexual health and HIV clinics since July 2017 in Scotland.
Rhoda Mackay.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary, thank the Minister for that very welcome answer. Last week, Teenage Cancer Trust launched their campaign Jabs for Lads, aimed at securing the vaccination for boys and young men. Can the Minister confirm if boys who've missed this due to their age will be offered the opportunity to get the vaccination?
Minister.
It is really important that everyone who's entitled to this vaccination take up the offer. And that's based on the evidence. So vaccination policy in Scotland, as with the rest of the UK, is based on the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, an independent expert panel which provides evidence based on impartial advice on matters relating to vaccination. The JCVI has not recommended a catch-up programme for HPV boys programme. Should that change, of course, I would not hesitate to act and extend our programme. This is something that I take very seriously, and I'm very keen to make sure that we were not just not being advised because we hadn't asked the question. So the CMO wrote to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation to seek their expert view on the policy of an HPV catch-up programme and the rationale, and they did not recommend. The argument for the girls' HPV vaccination catch-up programme was that it's been highly successful, achieving such a high uptake in the girls' programme that it helps stop the spread of HPV to boys, and that's known as herd immunity. Clearly, there's a group of young boys out there who would not be protected by herd immunity from girls and women, and that is men who have sex with men, which is why I would encourage anybody in that category to make sure that they get their vaccination.
Question 8, Daniel Johnson.
To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to regulate the use of private residential property for short-term lets.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is committed to working with local authorities, communities and business interests to ensure that local authorities have the appropriate regulatory powers to balance the needs and concerns of their communities with wider economic and tourism interests. Our consultation on the regulation of short-term lets closed on the 23rd of July, attracting over 1,000 responses. And we are currently considering those responses and will announce our plans later this year.
Daniel Johnson.
I'd thank the Minister for that response. And while I note the consultation over the summer, the only mention in the programme for government was the setting up of a working group. So I'd ask the Minister if he'd agree with Kate Campbell, the SNP convener for Housing and the Economy and City of Edinburgh Council, when she says about short-term lets that we are absolutely clear we need a licensing regime because it would mean that we could set local policies that address the particular challenges we face in Edinburgh. Surely it's right that we regulate the commercial use of residential property.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, as I indicated in my initial answer, we've had over 1,000 responses which we will have to analyse and look at very carefully before we decide how to move forward, and also take cognizance of different circumstances in different parts of the country. As well as the analysis which is underway, the Government has also commissioned research to explore the positive and negative impacts of short-term lets on communities with a focus on neighbourhoods and housing. And that research involves short-term let hosts, residents, local businesses and community actors across 5 places in Scotland: Edinburgh, the East Neuk of Fife, Fort William, Glasgow and Skye. And a report on that research will also be published before the end of the year. We must get this right, we must listen to all, and we should not rashly move forward without taking cognizance of all of the responses that we have had back.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Number 1 from Jackson Carter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And since today is his last First Minister's questions after 20 years, can I take this opportunity to thank Sir Paul Grice for his service to our Parliament and wish him well. Good news this morning for people in Rosyth, and also excellent news for those enduring cystic fibrosis. First-class announcements both. Less good news, though, if you're hoping to attend the Sick Kids Hospital. Formally proposed in 2008, originally scheduled to be open by 2013, the Sick Kids Hospital repeatedly delayed. 4 health secretaries, blunders, cost overruns. And yet it's only yesterday that the Scottish Government decides to appoint a troubleshooter to sort this mess out. First Minister, isn't this just too little, too late?
First Minister.
Well, first of all, can I take the opportunity also to thank Sir Paul Grice for his incredible contribution to the Scottish Parliament, that it has become the established institution of our democracy over a period of just 20 years is in no small way down to his efforts and his contributions. I'm sure the whole Chamber wishes him well for the future. Can I also warmly welcome the news this morning that Babcock has been selected as the preferred bidder for the 5 Type 31 frigates. That is good news for Rosyth, and I hope it will also be good news for the wider supply chain across Scotland. The Scottish Government will certainly be working hard to make sure that is the case. And lastly, because it has also been mentioned, can I take the opportunity to welcome the fact that the Scottish Government has now reached an agreement with the manufacturer of 2 cystic fibrosis drugs to make sure that they are available now to patients. We are the first UK nation to do so, and I think that is news that will be warmly welcomed, not just across this chamber, but across the country. Turning to the situation at the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital, can I make abundantly clear today that the situation is unacceptable. To say that I and the Health Secretary are angry about this situation would be an understatement, and I know that anger is shared by patients and staff. The focus of the Scottish Government is on putting this right. Firstly, and the Health Secretary made this very clear at the start of the summer, that we will not allow the hospital to open until we are satisfied about patient safety. Secondly, the Health Secretary instructed work to firstly establish the work that requires to be done to bring the hospital up to specification, and secondly to establish the reason for the problem with the critical care ventilation system. Both of those reports were published yesterday. I think the Health Secretary has met with or is meeting with opposition spokespeople today. In respect of the project, we have escalated our oversight to level 4, which means that there will be closer scrutiny and oversight. So there is an absolute focus in making sure that these problems are rectified, and I think that is what the public, patients and staff would expect to see from the Scottish Government.
Jackson Carter.
Look, First Minister, anger is all very well, but you didn't need to be a high-ranking government minister to know that there were major problems with this vital project going back years. You only had to read a newspaper. Yet we've had a Scottish Government with its head buried in the sand. So let me ask a specific question. In November last year, independent assessors made crystal clear that the hospital couldn't be made operational. So deep were the problems, staff were actually emailed and told they couldn't even be given a completion date. Didn't that ring alarm bells?
First Minister.
Can I just be very clear to Jackson Carlow? There were a number of issues identified and indeed publicly reported before July 2019. These are the reasons why the hospital was already late in opening. In fact, the KPGMP report provides a comprehensive summary of those issues. But the issue that has resulted in the delay that the Health Secretary confirmed to Parliament yesterday is an issue relating to the critical care ventilation system that only came to light at the start of July this year. Now, if Jackson Carlow is telling me he knew about that before then perhaps the question is why he didn't bring that to anybody else's attention, because I didn't know about it and the Health Secretary didn't know about that. That is the issue that has prevented the hospital opening now. And that is the issue that the Health Secretary is focused on ensuring is rectified. And we will continue to focus on that work as the Health Secretary set out in her statement to Parliament yesterday.
Jackson Carlow.
Yes, well, that was a new spin in project management shift there, I must say. Presiding officer, the Sick Kids Hospital is just 10 minutes drive from where we all are now. And yet it seems that 4 successive health ministers chose either not to know or simply failed to ask about the full extent of the problems faced until way, way too late. And the truth is, when it comes to this project, confusion reigned. For example, in June, the Health Secretary was confident enough about the project to tell MSPs in this chamber that everything was on track. And yet just a week later, the Health Board told her that those assurances were unfounded. I mean, what an absolute shambles. Does that sound to the First Minister like joined-up government?
First Minister.
Firstly, the previous issues that had been identified had been resolved, which is why the Health Secretary gave the comments she gave to Parliament in June. The issue that has resulted in this delay didn't come to light until the start of July. I didn't know about that. The senior management in the Health Board, as far as I am aware, did not know about that, and the Health Secretary didn't know about that. As soon as that came to light, the Health Secretary acted properly and appropriately. It would have been wrong to allow that hospital to open before assurances about patient safety could have been given. There has been substantial work done over the summer to make sure that any other issues have been identified. That was the subject of the National Services Scotland report that was published yesterday, and there has been substantial work done now to set out a timescale for the rectification, particularly to the critical care ventilation system, to be carried out, and a timescale to be laid out for the opening both of the Sick Kids Hospital and of the Department for Clinical Neurosciences. That is the responsible action the Health Secretary has taken. We will continue to make sure that that work is carried out so that the hospital does open. I deeply regret the hospital will be opening late, extremely late, and it is important that we make sure that every issue that has been identified is addressed so that when it does open, it is safe for the patients who will use that hospital.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, that's all very well, First Minister, but since January 2013, when the new Sick Kids was supposed to have opened, over 300,000 children have been denied access to the new hospital that they and their parents were entitled to expect, in A&E alone. This is a saga from which nobody emerges well, not the Health Board, not the contractor, and certainly not this government. And it's a saga that is altogether sadly too predictable. Ministerial assurances given, completion dates put back, costs spiral out of control. And at the end of it all, it seems absolutely nobody is held to account. First Minister, I think the country thinks for once heads should roll, don't you?
First Minister.
Well, the Health Secretary, of course, set out yesterday the work that will be done to establish issues of accountability within the Health Board. It is important that that is done in line with due process. The focus is on making sure that the rectification work is done, particularly in the critical care unit, although there were other aspects of work that the NSS report identified that will be taken forward in parallel. The Health Secretary also confirmed yesterday, I announced it in the programme for government last week, that we will be setting up a new national body, a centre of excellence to oversee in particular the construction and technical specification aspects of these new builds. The Scottish Government oversight traditionally looks at finances and the delivery timelines. So lessons absolutely have to be learned from this. I very much agree that this is a completely unacceptable situation, but our focus will remain patient safety, and that should be the priority of everybody who has anything to do with this project.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, can I add my thanks and best wishes to Paul Grice. I've known him for longer than probably either of us would care to admit, but he's been a figure of great stability in this Parliament since its very inception, a source of wise counsel, and he will be a very hard act to follow, and we wish him well. Presiding Officer, in March of this year, my colleague Daniel Johnson asked the Cabinet Secretary for Health in this chamber, and I quote, if the issues at the Edinburgh Sick Kids, coupled with the issues at the Queen Elizabeth, point to wider problems regarding hospital building and procurement in the National Health Service in Scotland. The Cabinet Secretary, with her customary disdain, replied, and I quote, I do not think that the issues point to wider problems, and accused Daniel Johnson of being wide of the mark. But he wasn't, First Minister, was he?
First Minister.
Well, Richard Leonard is absolutely right to point out there have been issues with the Queen Elizabeth and there are clearly problems now with the Sick Kids Hospital. There have been other hospitals built without those issues, but the question here, of course, is about how we ensure appropriate oversight. That is why the announcement that I've just referred to about the establishment of a new body, which I would have hoped is something that Labour would welcome, to make sure that we are reflecting carefully on the issues that have arisen in these two hospitals. Our focus is very much on ensuring that the problem that was identified in early July around the ventilation system is put right. That has been the focus of the work done over the summer to get to the point that the Health Secretary announced yesterday, and that focus will continue. That's what we owe to the patients and the staff of that hospital, is to put those issues right and make sure that when it does open, it is a safe hospital for the patients who will use it.
Richard Leonard.
Is the First Minister really telling the people of Scotland that the answer to this abject failure in new hospital building is the creation of another public body as yet unnamed? The report that came out yesterday told us some important truths. Firstly, that the Scottish Government was on the programme board for this project. That frequent meetings were held between NHS Lothian and the Scottish Government, and I quote, in order to allow the Cabinet Secretary to be briefed. Yet the Cabinet Secretary told this chamber in March that it is excellent news that the board will take over the hospital from July and that patients will be in it from then. So we know who is wide of the mark now. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary for Health was forced to come to this Parliament to admit that this major facility of strategic importance will not now open until autumn 2020. The Cabinet Secretary was wrong in her response that the hospital would open in July. Does the First Minister also accept that the Cabinet Secretary was wrong in dismissing the wider issues of hospital building and procurement?
First Minister.
Nobody is dismissing any of these serious issues. In terms of the Cabinet Secretary's statement to Parliament in June, at that point, that was our firm expectation that the hospital would open in July. All of the issues that had previously been identified had been resolved, and that was the information that the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government had. An issue then came to light that hadn't previously been known to us. The KPMG report published yesterday sets out, in summary, it's a long and a technical report, but in summary it sets out that a particular document called the Environmental Matrix had in part the wrong specification for the ventilation system. That is something that the board should have picked up, and the report sets out opportunities for that to have done, but it wasn't done. When that came to light in the start of July, the Health Secretary took the action that has been reported to this Parliament and set in train the work that requires to be done to rectify that problem and ensure that the hospital opens safely. That is the responsible conduct of a Health Secretary focused in making sure that patient safety is the overriding priority.
Richard Leonard.
But this is a hospital that was already way over timetable. Does the First Minister not understand just how angry people are about this? We've got a children's hospital in Edinburgh that can't open its doors, and we were reminded at the weekend that we have a hospital in Glasgow built by the same contractor that has been closing its doors to a children's cancer ward. And Audit Scotland is saying that there needs to be a review of whole project contracting to help with preventative and reactive measures. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need full public transparency to restore public trust. So what will it take for the First Minister to finally listen and deliver a full public inquiry into this abject failure of governance and government?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government will continue to do the work and take the action to rectify the issue that has been identified at the Sick Kids in Edinburgh. That is the responsible thing to do. Richard Leonard said, do I understand the anger? Yes, I absolutely do. I share the anger that patients and staff feel about this thoroughly unacceptable situation. The Health Board's responsibility was to ensure that this hospital was built to the right specification. In this respect, it hasn't discharged that responsibility, and there are questions that still require to be asked in that respect. Our job now is to make sure that the work is done to rectify that work is done as quickly as possible, that it is done to the requisite standards, and when that hospital opens, it is a safe environment for the patients who will use it, and the Scottish Government will remain absolutely focused on discharging that responsibility.
We have some constituency supplementaries. The first from John Mason, to be followed by Alexander Stewart. John Mason.
Thank you very much. Given the problems there have been around marches in Glasgow over the last 2 weekends, does the First Minister agree that Glasgow City Council has made the right decision by prohibiting marches this weekend?
First Minister.
Yes, I do think the City Council has arrived at the right decision in not giving permission for the marches that were planned for this weekend. I believe, as I said last week, that the right to march is an important part of our democracy. But those who are abusing that right, I think, are putting it into jeopardy for others. It is also vital that the rights of the majority of law-abiding citizens are protected and given priority. So I think Glasgow City Council has taken the right decision. Obviously, it takes those decisions in light of the advice it receives from the police. I think there are longer-term questions about whether there are changes required to the law, and we will continue to have that dialogue with Glasgow City Council.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, like me, you are delighted that the news that 5 new Type 31 frigates are to be built at Rosyth by a consortium led by Babcock. This contract will secure millions of pounds into my region of Mid-Scotland and Fife and guarantee hundreds of jobs. This once again goes to show the outstanding skills of the Scottish workforce and the strength of the United Kingdom when orders of this nature are guaranteed and secured. Will the First Minister join with me in welcoming this boost to the Scottish economy?
First Minister.
Yes, I do think this is good news for the Scottish economy. I also think it is a real tribute to the expertise of the workforce at Rosyth. I'm not going to dwell on the fact that this is the promises that were made years ago in terms of the number of Type 26 frigates were not kept, but because this is good news. Our job now, and the Finance Secretary has spoken to Babcock this morning, where he congratulated them and gave them the assurance that they had the full support of the Scottish Government. So we need to work with them now to make sure that the benefit, not just to Rosyth, although that is obviously significant, but the benefit to the whole Scottish supply chain is realised. Obviously, we hope that there may be benefits to Ferguson Marine in the course of this as well. So we will continue to work with the company and the workforce to make sure all of these benefits are realised.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Can I thank the First Minister and Jean Freeman for listening to cystic fibrosis campaigners like my constituent Kelly Gallagher and agreeing a deal with Vertex to make Orkambi and Simkevi free for all on the NHS. Can I ask the First Minister, though, what arrangements are in place with health boards to ensure that patients receive medication quickly?
First Minister.
Well, we will make sure that the impact of this announcement today about the agreement between the Scottish Government and the manufacturers fully reflected in the decisions that health boards take. I think this is good news. This has not been
an easy agreement to arrive at. There have been a number of complexities. I think it is good news that we have arrived at it. It is a 5-year agreement that, of course, will allow data about the benefits of these drugs to be gathered as well. And there may be lessons in this for our approach to other drugs as well. But I know there will be cystic fibrosis patients and their families across the country today who are very relieved about this. And I know that everybody will welcome what is exceptionally good news.
Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, on behalf of the Scottish Green Party, I too would like to congratulate Paul Grice on his 20 years of service and his good humour and wise counsel to us all. First Minister, you'll be aware that there's a planned school climate strike next Friday, and you may also be aware that the City of Edinburgh Council has refused permission for the planned rally to use certain streets in the capital. Now, whilst such decisions are properly for the Council, in light of media reports that young people may face arrest or be locked up, does she agree with me that this is nonsense? That no young person will face such action for exercising their rights to peaceful protest, and that we should all reassure young people that they have the right to peaceful protest and that they should be encouraged and supported to exercise it?
First Minister.
Well, two things. Issues around permission and roads, etc., are for the Council. Obviously, issues around arrests and criminal justice generally here, I'm not talking in this particular instance, are for the police, and it would be thoroughly inappropriate for me to comment on operational matters. But generally speaking, in relation to the climate strikers, I've made very clear in the past my views. I think they are views that accord very closely to Andy Whiteman's. I think it is actually very positive, very heartening, very uplifting to see the younger generation feel so passionate about climate change that they are prepared to protest and make their views known in the way that they are. And I would hope that all of us would listen to that and take account of what the younger generation are telling us. I know this government is, and I hope governments across the world do. So I wish those who are taking part in the protest next Friday the very best.
And Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, last weekend Kiko Milano in Aberdeen announced it will close with the loss of all jobs, and it was reported that this was partly down to the eye-watering business rates faced by businesses in our city. So will the First Minister heed the demands of businesses in Aberdeen and instruct our Finance Minister to review the rates regime, or stand by whilst more Aberdeen businesses go under?
First Minister.
Well, of course, in terms of the business rates regime, it has very recently been reviewed and a number of changes have been taken forward. In terms of individual decisions, they are taken independently by the valuation system. We have one of, if not the most competitive business rates regimes anywhere in the UK, and we will continue to look at how we support businesses in all parts of our country, particularly given the increasingly difficult circumstances they face as a result of Brexit.
And question number 3, Willie Rennie.
Can I too thank Paul Grice for his work and wish him well for the future too. I think we are closer than ever in our efforts to stop Brexit. But the publication today of the Yellowhammer paper lays bare the mass disruption to our way of life that would come with a no-deal Brexit. Yet that's one that Boris Johnson's Conservatives want to embrace. What's most shocking is that these horrors are the prediction of the Conservative government itself, yet still they plough on. Can the First Minister tell us if any of the details laid out in the Yellowhammer paper that were published this morning were new to the Scottish Government? And if so, what new measures she is putting in place to mitigate this damage?
First Minister.
Well, I do think the publication of the Yellowhammer planning assumptions yesterday lays bare for the public the horrors of a no-deal Brexit, and it is shocking that it has taken so long for that information to be published. Can I very directly say to Willie Rennie, in terms of Yellowhammer planning assumptions, what we have seen in the Scottish Government is what was published last night. The only difference I can confirm is in the title of the document. The version we had the title base scenario rather than reasonable worst case scenario, as appeared on the document that was published last night. It's for the UK Government to explain if there is any significance to that. We have been expecting an update of that document, which is dated the 2nd of August. We haven't yet received an update of it. We also received the papers for the Cabinet subcommittee meetings we are invited to. So so far, though, since the new government took office, that's only been 4 out of around 30. The Deputy First Minister has just come from one of those this morning. We also know there's a series of mitigation plans lying behind these planning assumptions. In terms of our own work, we are planning on the basis of the Yellowhammer assumptions, although we have been and continue to await the update of that, and we have a range of mitigation plans in place. We are currently considering what format of this information it will be most helpful to publish, and we intend to make a statement to Parliament about that as soon as possible.
Willie Rennie.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? This is affecting real people's lives right now. Anna Ruth Cockerham from St Andrews has a chronic condition. It's called functional neurological disorder. She takes controlled medication that can only be prescribed 28 days at a time. Any break in medication worsens her seizures and the pain can last for weeks. Her prescription is due at the end of October, and she is anxious about her health in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This is the real-life consequences of the Conservatives' cavalier approach to Brexit. Anna Ruth wants government to allow prescriptions of these controlled drugs to be issued 2 weeks early to ensure there is no break in the supply. Has the First Minister made arrangements for this to happen?
First Minister.
I'm happy to provide more specific information on that specific point. We are doing everything we can to mitigate any impact on drugs and medicines supplies. Obviously, the key player in this is the UK Government, and to some extent we are dependent on the information flow that comes from the UK Government. But we have a range of mitigation plans in place, and I will undertake, not just to Willie Rennie, but to Parliament generally, to consider, as I said a moment ago, how we best publish this information, both about assumptions and about our mitigation plans that inform Parliament, but also inform the wider public. Willie Rennie is right to say that it is beggars belief and is completely outrageous that we have a government that is prepared to contemplate a scenario that in its own planning assumptions says could result in delays to the supply of medicine. And the Yellowhammer document that was published last night is very clear about the restrictions of stockpiling to mitigate against those impacts. So I share Willie Rennie's deep concern about this. I share his anger that we are in this situation. I give an undertaking that the Scottish Government will do everything we can to mitigate these impacts. But I also have a duty to be frank with people that we will not be able to do everything to mitigate every impact of this. And it's important over these next few weeks that we have that very frank dialogue with this Parliament and with the wider public as we help those members of the public to prepare as well as they possibly can.
Thank you. There's a few further supplementary questions. The first from Maureen Watt, to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, in advance of a major UK-wide conference tomorrow on the serious problem of knife violence and the fact that a 5-year study in Edinburgh found that of sharp instruments used in homicides, 94% were kitchen knives, would she agree with me that Scotland can be at the forefront of the campaign to replace sharp pointed knives that have been proven to have had significant penetrative capabilities with round-ended ones?
First Minister.
Yes, I think there is the potential for Scotland to be at the forefront of initiatives like that. Maureen Watt is right to raise this very important issue. Tackling violence from knives and indeed all forms of violence is a priority for this government and indeed for any government. Our approach to knife crime in particular is focused firmly on prevention and early intervention. Over the past decade, police recorded crimes of handling an offensive weapon have fallen and emergency admissions to hospitals have fallen. But we recognise the devastating consequences that violence has on individuals, families and communities. So we know that much more needs to be done. That's why we continue to invest in No Knives Better Lives, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit and Medics Against Violence. And we are, as I said at the outset, we are very open to exploring any evidence showing that anti-stab knives are an effective approach to tackling violent crime.
Thank you. Michelle Ballantyne, to be followed by Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, the Government published the Children's Scotland Bill. Many respondents to the consultation, including 2 of my constituents here in the gallery today, asked that there should be a presumption in law in favour of granting grandparents an automatic right of access to contact with their grandchildren. On 3 other occasions in this chamber, prior to the bill's publication, the Minister for Community Safety had advised that next steps in regards to this were being considered. Can the First Minister please advise for what reason this presumption was not included in the bill, and will this government ever introduce or consider such a presumption?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I welcome Michelle Ballantyne's constituents to the chamber? Can I say 2 things? Firstly, I will ask the relevant minister to write to her to give detail of the consideration of this particular provision that has been made and the reasons why it is not included in the bill. But the second, perhaps more important point I would make, which Michelle Ballantyne alluded to herself, is that this bill is at its very early stages. It is currently open for consultation. It will then go through the normal stage 1 process. So it is open to individuals, to organisations, indeed to members of this Parliament to bring forward suggestions for amendment, and there will be opportunity for the committee and Parliament as a whole to consider those. And I would encourage Michelle Ballantyne's constituents, if they feel that they have evidence to bring to bear to this, to take part in that consultation and that process.
Anna Sarwar to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Presiding Officer, next week Scotland's whisky workers are taking unprecedented strike action to try and win a pay offer that meets the cost of living. Their employer Diageo is a large and important employer, plays a key part in Scotland's economy and has a strong reputation nationally and internationally. It also records a pre-tax profit of more than £4 billion and awarded a 30% pay rise to their chief executive. Does the First Minister agree with me that this is a business that can well afford to give their workers at Shield Hall in Glasgow, Leven in Fife and distilleries all around Scotland a fair pay rise? And will she join me in calling on Diageo to get back around the table with the GMB and Unite unions and find a fair resolution?
First Minister.
Firstly, I am aware of this dispute in general terms. Diageo, as Anna Sarwar has just alluded to, is a private company. I'm not aware of all of the details of the dispute, but I hope my commitment to fair work and to fair treatment of workers is well known. So I would absolutely join with Anna Sarwar in calling on Diageo to get back round the table with the trade unions, Unite and GMB, to find a fair resolution to this in the interests of their workforce.
Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister how the current suspension of the UK Parliament affects her government and this Parliament's preparations for Brexit, and why, if prorogation is unlawful, Westminster isn't back to work?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, in terms of the practical implications of the UK Parliament being suspended, I think, particularly in light of the publication of the Yellowhammer planning assumptions last night, it is vital that Parliament is there scrutinising and holding to account this government, and that would be a helpful process in terms of the Scottish Government's own planning to try to get as much information out of the UK Government as possible. But I think the big question for the Prime Minister and the Government this morning is why on earth Parliament is still suspended. We had Scotland's highest civil court yesterday declaring the prorogation of Parliament as unlawful. Parliament should be back to work scrutinising this government, because if any government needed scrutinising, this UK government certainly does.
John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, yesterday the Court of Session ruled that the First Minister acted unlawfully by proroguing the...
Prime Minister.
I do beg your pardon. I do beg your pardon. I would never suggest any inappropriateness on the part of the First Minister. Yesterday, the Court of Session ruled that the Prime Minister acted unlawfully by proroguing the UK Parliament. Regardless of whether we agree with any individual judgment, does the First Minister agree it's outrageous that Downing Street sources seek to undermine the Court, with a Minister on TV implying that the judges were biased? And can the First Minister outline what action the Scottish Government will take to defend the judiciary from these outrageous and unfounded attacks?
First Minister.
Well, I'm very glad, firstly, that John Finney clarified that it was the Prime Minister that was found by the Court of Session yesterday to have acted unlawfully. I mean, yesterday's judgment is of huge constitutional significance. As I said yesterday, I said again today, I think the political implications of it should be straightforward. Parliament should be back in session immediately. But if that wasn't bad enough yesterday, what we heard directly and indirectly from key people or people within the Conservative Party attacking the independence and the integrity of the judiciary was absolutely disgraceful and shocking. I have to say I was glad to hear Jackson Carlow and others on the Tory benches here defend the integrity and the independence of the judiciary. Whatever our views on individual judgments, our court system is a vital part of our democracy and the separation of powers, and I think it is not just wrong but deeply dangerous for politicians of any party to attack the independence of the judiciary, and I think it is incumbent on all of us to stand up for that.
Question number 4, Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what support the Scottish Government is providing to people struggling to meet funeral costs.
First Minister.
From next Monday, we will start providing funeral support payments. This will provide much needed help with the cost of arranging a funeral for people on low-income benefits. As with all of the Scottish benefits, we've simplified the process and removed the barriers to applying. We've also made changes to eligibility so that around 40% more people will be able to access this support than would receive help under the predecessor UK Government scheme. The payment complements work already undertaken by the Government to tackle funeral poverty, including our guidance on funeral costs, which encourages providers to make the cost of their services more transparent and accessible.
Richard Lyle.
I thank the First Minister for that answer and welcome what is being done. With this month marking the first anniversary of the Social Security Scotland, it is clear what a positive difference the Scottish Government has already made with new powers over social security, especially compared to the UK system it replaced. While this is of course welcome, does the First Minister think the Scottish Government will always be limited in what it can achieve when the majority of powers are still held in the hands of an incompetent and uncaring government at Westminster, which is entirely distracted with Brexit chaos?
First Minister.
Well, Richard Lyle is absolutely correct. There are many people who are receiving financial support in Scotland that would not be receiving that support if the Scottish Government hadn't taken responsibility for these benefits. So I think we are demonstrating day in and day out, in practical and tangible terms, the real value of having these powers lying in the hands of a democratically elected Scottish Parliament and not in the hands of a Westminster Government, particularly a Tory Westminster Government. So I think it is common sense to look at the experience of our delivery of benefits so far and come to the conclusion, if you weren't already of that view, which I of course already was, that the sooner we have the entirety of welfare decisions in the hands of this Parliament and out of the hands of a Tory Westminster Government, the better for all of us.
Question number 5, Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank the Presiding Officer and ask the First Minister when an action plan for delivery of residential services for drug and alcohol rehabilitation across the country will be provided in line with its drug and alcohol strategy?
First Minister.
We're currently engaging with stakeholders on the draft action plan with a view to publishing the finalised plan in October for the Rights, Respect and Recovery strategy. This will include actions on residential rehabilitation and support the development of more effective services across Scotland. Clearly, the recent drugs death figure shows that we are facing a public health emergency, which is why we've also announced an additional £20 million over the next 2 years to support efforts across the country to bring these numbers down.
Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank the First Minister for this announcement, and I understand for including the actions called for by the Aberdeenshire Drug and Alcohol Partnership. However, this was communicated to them yesterday by telephone, and it would seem in response to my lodging of this question and being picked up by the Press and Journal. So can I ask the First Minister when her government will start to tackle this issue proactively rather than in reaction to bad headlines?
First Minister.
Genuine apologies. I'm not entirely aware of the phone call that the member is referring to. I'm very happy to look into that. But the Government is dealing with this and responding to this proactively. We have acknowledged, I think rightly, and I think this is a view shared, that we face a public health emergency. We recognise that increased investment is necessary, which is why the £20 million that I referred to today was announced in the programme for government. But we also recognise that we need to do things differently. We need to be open to new approaches, which is why, for example, and it is only one part of the overall solution here, not the whole story, which is one of the reasons why we continue to press the Home Office to either allow or devolve powers to the Scottish Government to enable us to allow the safe consumption facility that Glasgow is so keen to see, because experts say that can make a difference. So we will continue to make the investment and to be open to new approaches, and I would encourage everybody across the chamber to do likewise. This is something we should absolutely be prepared to come together on and be determined to tackle.
Fiona Robertson.
On those new approaches, can the First Minister say what communication the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government on the drug death crisis, including the use of supervised overdose prevention rooms to help reduce drug deaths in Scotland? And does she believe the approach of the UK Government reflects the spirit of working together on this important issue?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, we received communication from the UK Government towards the end of last week confirming their current position on the safe consumption room proposal. I deeply regret that. I do believe that we all have a duty to look at new approaches. I readily concede that this is not the only answer, but experts say it is a significant part of the answer, and therefore I call again on the Home Office to reconsider their position. Also, regrettably, the Home Office indicated that they would not be prepared to take part in the Drug Summit that we have said that we are going to convene in Glasgow. Again, I think that is the wrong decision, and I take the opportunity today to ask them to reconsider that. We should be coming together. I absolutely recognise the principal responsibility that lies on the shoulders of my government, but drugs law is largely reserved, and therefore we need the active cooperation of the UK Government to make sure we have a fully holistic approach to this. So I hope they will think again about both of the aspects of that letter and come to different conclusions.
Thank you. I would note that yet again there's quite a lot of interest across the chamber in asking supplementaries on this issue, but we don't have enough time. There'll be an opportunity to participate in a members' debate later in the week. Can I call question 6, Monica Lennon?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The members' business starts immediately after FMQs, so please don't rush away. But to ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reported concerns for patient and staff safety at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
First Minister.
The safety and well-being of patients and staff at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and indeed at all hospitals is the absolute priority. We welcome the input of NHS Education for Scotland and the General Medical Council, who are part of an independent scrutiny regime across NHS Scotland with regard to doctors in training. I expect NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to work closely with these bodies to implement their recommendations, and the GMC, I know, has welcomed the progress that's been made so far. Following recent concerns, the Health Secretary, of course, commissioned an independent review of the process of procurement and delivery of the hospital and how it contributes to effective infection prevention. The co-chairs of that review made a call for evidence in June and are currently assessing what has been received so far.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the First Minister for her answer. The Herald and Herald on Sunday have reported that children with cancer have been hit by infections at the hospital. The kids' cancer ward remains closed to new admissions. Safety faults at Edinburgh Sick Kids were caught hours before patients moved in, but the problems at the Queen Elizabeth only became public after it opened and are affecting some of Scotland's sickest children right now. Both hospitals were built by the same contractor. Can the First Minister vouch for the safety of children and other patients at the Queen Elizabeth? Is she satisfied, and will she apologise for the shocking feelings at this hospital?
First Minister.
Well, I think, as I have said in this chamber before, I have no hesitation in apologising to any patient who doesn't get the treatment that they have a right to expect in our National Health Service. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of patients do, but when the NHS falls short of the expected standards, there is a duty for lessons to be learned and for apologies to be made, and I have never hesitated in that. In terms of the safety of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital provides some of the best healthcare anywhere in the world. It has some of the best healthcare staff. They provide exemplary care to patients day in and day out. Where issues arise, and there are issues with infection, which are not unique. Infection, as we've debated in this chamber before, unfortunately is a challenge for healthcare systems across the world. It is absolutely essential that the right actions are taken. Infection prevention is vital, infection control is vital, and we expect health boards to put in place the right processes to keep patients in their hospitals safe. That is what everybody has a right to expect from our National Health Service.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. Can I just add, in the 20 years I've had the pleasure of knowing our Clerk and Chief Executive, Sir Paul Grice, I've never known him as at a loss for words. But if I could just explain to members, to the gallery and to those following proceedings that other than swearing in members, our officials are not allowed to take part in formal proceedings, and so Paul cannot respond to any of these kind tributes that were paid to him this afternoon. There will be an event after Parliament this evening at which myself, other members of staff and members of Parliament will be able to talk about Paul's leadership role in building the reputation of this institution, and he will be able to respond and unencumbered by office, tell us what he really thinks of the members of this Parliament. And on that note, I'm going to suspend before we resume with members' business. A short suspension.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
The next item of business is members' business debate on motion 18420 in the name of Monica Lennon on Scotland's drug death public health emergency. And this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. May I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And before I call the opening contribution, can I say to all members, this debate is very highly subscribed, and so people will have to be very, very tight on their timings, or some members will have to drop off the speakers list. So it's in your hands. And I call on Monica Lennon to open the debate for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every 7 hours, a life in Scotland is being lost to drug overdose. This is a national emergency and it needs an urgent emergency response. So I'm grateful to the members who signed my motion, because in doing so, they have made it possible for this debate to go ahead today and for Scotland's drug death emergency to be recognised in our national parliament. I know we are tight for time, so we do need to have a longer debate in government time and to have regular updates, because that is the very least that we can do. One drug-related death is a tragedy. One is a tragedy. So it is horrifying that almost 1,200 people died from drug overdose during 2018. The death toll has doubled in a decade. And if that wasn't shocking enough, Scotland's drug death rate is the highest in the UK, the highest in Europe, the highest in the world. Presiding Officer, thousands of grieving, trauma-stricken families are being left behind, and they feel ignored and abandoned by us and our public services. Those who have died for the purposes of officialdom and statistics are described as drug users or addicts, but they are and they were people. And they once had hopes and dreams like all of us. When I look around the chamber, I see members who are sincere in wanting to tackle this crisis. But we must not kid ourselves that we are doing enough. When I picked up the programme for government unveiled by the First Minister last week, I was shocked when I flicked to page 102 and read the words, "We are doing everything we can to save lives." This can't be serious. Now, as someone who's lost a parent to alcoholism, I have the self-awareness to know that I get a bit emotional about this. I have a heightened emotional response. But the First Minister is kidding herself on if she thinks that there isn't more that her government can do. Because treatment and support services are underfunded and struggling to provide help to everyone who needs it. Our prisons are rife with drugs. Drug users are still called horrible and dehumanising names, whether it's on the streets or in newspapers. And stigma is real, and stigma kills. Over half of people in Scotland believe that if someone goes through a hospital door because of drugs or alcohol misuse, they should pay something towards their care. Mothers and fathers are burying their sons and daughters. Children are being left without their parents. Friends are losing multiple friends to drug-related illness and suicide. And the statistics probably don't even tell the full story. Over 6,000 people, 6,418 families lost a loved one during the lifetime of the Scottish Government's 2008 Road to Recovery strategy. Presiding Officer, Scotland's drug death emergency is tragic, it is heart-wrenching, and it is shameful, and it cannot be allowed to continue. Now, the programme for government clearly states that drug-related deaths are preventable. And on this, ministers are absolutely correct. The motion we are debating is asking the Scottish Government to legally designate a public health emergency, not just talk about one. The legislation which allows ministers to do this and bring forward regulations, if so required, is the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. SPICE, the Scottish Parliament's highly respected and independent research unit, has confirmed this. And the Government's Preparing Scotland document explains the Act is concerned with how to deal with consequences of emergencies, which it defines as events that threaten serious damage to human life. And what would this legal designation do? Well, it would allow ministers to direct and coordinate and monitor the response of our public bodies, health boards, local councils, the police, to make sure that our communities and our people are getting exactly what they need. The situation in Dundee, which my colleague, if I just can continue, the situation in Dundee, which my colleague Jenny Marra will address, is quite different from what's happening in other parts of the country, like, for example, in Glasgow. So we need to know that targeted action and progress is being achieved. There needs to be transparency, there needs to be accountability. I don't know if I'm going to get extra time to take an intervention. I'm really sorry to Stuart McMillan. We know that alcohol and drug services have faced real-term cuts in recent years, and that's made it very difficult to support everyone. So an emergency response must be supported by the resources to address this. This morning in the Parliament there was an event in partnership with the Daily Record that gave people who have direct experience of substance misuse the chance to be heard and be visible in Parliament. Many of them, there's a lot of them, they're in the public gallery, and I want to thank all of them, including my constituents who've come from Hamilton. I know that Blameless are represented who are based at Hamilton Accies, and I want to thank the Minister for being there today. I thank the Daily Record for their campaign to put the drug death emergency higher up the political agenda, and I thank Mark McGivern, the journalist who's largely been driving that. Today, MSPs from all of the parties have signed up to a Daily Record pledge board, and that's really positive, and I hope that all MSPs will sign it, including the Public Health Minister, because that pledge is about recognising that Scotland faces a drug death crisis that should be treated as a national emergency, that we pledge to do everything we can to end the crisis of substance misuse in every part of Scotland, and to campaign for significant new funding to help fund harm reduction and recovery services. Because we can't stand by and watch vulnerable people die every 7 hours. We are supposed to be a progressive and compassionate country. It's not good enough to announce a ministerial task force in March, to count our dead in July, and to wait until the middle of September to get people in a room. The task force will be accountable to ministers, but in the end, ministers will be accountable to the people. So when the Minister gets to his feet, will he confirm if he believes government has acted quickly enough? Is there more that can be done? And does he expect to see a reduction in drug deaths where the 2019 figures are published? In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am asking, I am urging, I am begging the Scottish Government to show the leadership I know it can show and the compassion, activate and coordinate an emergency response to this national tragedy. Our most vulnerable citizens cannot be left to die from preventable disease.
Can I say to those in the public gallery, please, it's inappropriate to show appreciation or otherwise in members' contributions. Perhaps at the end, you can speak to those who've contributed. We now move to the open debate and speeches of no more than 4 minutes, please. John Mason, followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Monica Lennon for raising this very important subject today here in Parliament. Can also start by welcoming the extra 20 million that the Government has promised in its programme for government. And I appreciate getting the opportunity to speak in the drug death debate today, although I have to say I'm sad that we are having to have a debate on this topic at all. Scotland clearly has a serious drug problem, a problem that is very evident in my constituency of Glasgow-Shettleston, where both drug addiction and drug deaths are highly visible. I think I'd like to make 2 main points today. Firstly, we need to recognise there are usually underlying reasons for drug use, and the drugs themselves may be the result of something deeper. And secondly, I absolutely agree we should treat this as a health issue, while accepting that there are impacts beyond just health. So firstly, I would suggest that with most addictions, including drugs, people often have underlying problems, including, for example, breakdown of family relationships, major financial problems, mental health issues, lack of hope, and so on. So we cannot just deal with the drug usage on its own, but we do need to take a wider and a preventative approach to the whole issue. In this respect, I do not believe there is one simple solution. This is urgent, but it is going to take time to turn around. In this regard, I note that the motion focuses almost exclusively on the public sector, and absolutely the public sector is a major player. But I do not believe the public sector on its own is able to prevent deaths linked to drugs. For a start, families in the third sector have a very major part to play as well. They can give individuals the time and the support that they need, which frankly the public sector is unable to do. I'm sorry, the time is too limited. I was interested also in an Evening Times article this week, who have also been campaigning on this on Monday, which focused on the Family Addiction Support Service, FAS. One of the volunteers was quoted, and she was saying that she had a son aged 50 who had been involved with drugs for 30 years. And she makes the point that individuals themselves have to want to change. And this is an important point, I think, for us to remember when we say that all drug deaths are preventable. Secondly, I agree that this is a health issue and we should treat it as a health problem or crisis or emergency as people see fit. Therefore, I do think that safe consumption rooms can be part of the answer. My question on this is, if other parts of the NHS both look after the patient and provide the medication required, surely that should be the case with drugs too. A system which relies on people buying their drugs illegally from organised criminals, perhaps forcing a partner into prostitution to get the money, as I'm afraid happens in my constituency, and with drug gangs being involved, which leads on to violence, cannot be a good system. So if this is a health issue, as it is, I would argue that we need to emphasise the likes of heroin-assisted treatment as the preferred route. I understand HAT is already legal, although there are a number of conditions around it, and perhaps these are too restrictive and need to be reviewed. I gather that Switzerland has a long history of providing HAT. The Swiss model of HAT combines prescribed supply with the associated benefits that it incurs, such as purity, with supervised use in a safe and hygienic facility. Since the introduction of HAT in Switzerland, I understand health outcomes for heroin users have improved significantly. Illicit heroin consumption has been reduced, medically prescribed heroin has not made its way into illicit markets, and medicalisation of heroin has reduced initiation of it by new users. In the UK, medically prescribed heroin has been legal since 1926, yet programmes are not widely available. Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership are pushing ahead with plans to open an HAT centre in Glasgow, and I very much welcome that. But let's remember that this is a long-running problem, and sadly, the answers will not be quick or easy. Thank you.
Miles Briggs, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking Monica Lennon and the Labour Party for bringing forward this debate today. This is the second opportunity we've had to actually discuss drug deaths, the last being when Conservatives had to use their business to bring forward this. So I hope the Minister has heard that message, that we should have government debate time on this, and I hope that's something we'll be bringing forward as soon as possible. Now, over the summer recess, I've undertook a number of visits across Scotland to meet with people who are running drug services, because I think we need to start by looking where have we gone so wrong. And from people working on the front line, it's quite clear that this is a public health emergency, but one that they can't actually meet because of lack of resource. And I think that's something we need to be absolutely clear about from the very start. I visited the Minister's own constituency, where I met with people in the Lockheed hub there. Now, they were telling me in terms of adult services with AdAction, the work they were doing, which was making a difference. But the same people also told me that Youth AdAction had had all their services cut in all the secondary schools and primary schools within Dundee after the cuts this government made to funding. Now, that has had an impact on services, and I'm really concerned that actually, as we stand here today, services across Scotland are being threatened and are closing. So we need to see action from the government now to look at that and to prevent these services from closing as well. Now, one of the areas which I have picked up and I think is really important, and I hope we will not just wait for the task force to take this forward, but is around mental health support. Because it's quite clear from everyone I've spoken to that actually you aren't able to start any sort of holistic support around mental health until you're seen as being clean or actually being under management. I think that's wrong because most people want to start that support straight away. So that's something we need to look at capacity. Now, we have debates in here around access to mental health services, the CAMS crisis. It's not going to be clear where that is going to come from and what it's going to look like. But I think we have to look at where the third sector can really step in to support that. Now, on the issue of the task force, in the time that I've got today, I wanted to be clear that I welcome the task force, we've said that, and those who are serving on it. But I think it's quite clear that families and people with lived experience do not feel there is an adequate level of representation for them on the task force. Now, there's lots of organisations that I know many are represented in the chamber today, and I welcome all the positive work that they do, but just feeding in that experience, I don't think they have the confidence that they'll actually have their voice heard. So can I ask the Minister at this stage if he would consider including more people with lived experience and from families as well to be included on the task force and to expand it? It's an ask they're putting forward, and I think it's a sensible one, and I think would attract cross-party support today. Above all, that strategy, above all, the task force, as it brings forward positive, I hope, contributions to how we can turn this around, I hope we see that commissioned on an ongoing basis. And I know already, as Monica Lennon has mentioned, that the Minister's agreed to meet with us on a monthly basis. I think we need to, as a Parliament, really drive forward change and drive forward a reform of services. The Minister, like I say, has agreed to that, and I hope that can be something which we can have a whole Parliament-wide view on this. Also, in terms of a cross-party effort, it's quite clear that every party in here is committed to try to bring forward change, and policy suggestions we've all put forward. I last year published our life plan policy. I hope we can actually look at each of these policy areas we want to see change and reform and not just have them put to one side. This is a national emergency, and we need the Scottish Government and every minister to look towards their own portfolios collectively and take responsibility. Local government, the health service and our education service are all going to have to step up to take an emergency response to this. I hope we see that, and I hope when we have a proper government debate on this that we'll have all ministers able to take part in that. Thank you.
Emma Harper, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be speaking in the debate and thank Monica Lennon for bringing it forward. From the outset, I want to express my condolences for any family who have lost loved ones who have died as a result of the effects of alcohol or drugs use. Everyone involved who has experienced harm from use and misuse of alcohol or drugs must be treated with dignity, respect, and must be supported. I also want to put on record my thanks to the Minister for his work that I know he has put into this issue. He visited Paris during recess to observe and listen to their approaches. There's been documents published, and he's given this issue time, and the issue is claiming so many lives, as we have rightly heard earlier. It is a complex issue, and I've got so many notes in front of me just from even attending the round table this morning and hearing about the experiences, the lived experiences from the people speaking about it. But as a nurse, I can talk about the complex physiological issue that's happening to people who are overdosing. Sometimes the folks that are having effects of harmful use are also smokers. Smokers have often issues related to lung poor health. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease leads to baseline oxygen saturation levels that are maybe not the healthiest. And then when other drugs are taken on top of that, it can lead to an over-sedation an over-sedation issue in the body, which causes further oxygen saturation reduction, leading to critical events. So even if we have safe consumption facilities, many of the people who are taking drugs in rural areas would not necessarily have access to these facilities. But when people take drugs on their own, that is a real risk as well, and that's something that has to be addressed and challenged, especially in rural areas. I also would like to thank the Minister for attending River Garden at Auchincruive in Ayrshire with me earlier, just before recess. The charity run by IFDAS, Independence from Drugs and Alcohol Scotland, is run by a great team of people, including the service users. It's a peer-supported place where people who have lived experience can live together, work together and support each other. And, you know, just listening to the experiences of Natalie, Sharon and Darren this morning, that is part of helping. And the Minister noted Darren's passion for speaking, following an apology from Darren for being so aggressive. And the Minister said if we lose our passion, it means we don't care anymore. So we need to make sure that we do continue that passion and care so that we can help save more Scottish lives. I am interested in the information about the Scottish Affairs Committee that pursued this in Westminster. I was able to attend Westminster with colleagues Dave Stewart and Brian Whittle, and I see Jed Killen is in the chamber today. He is a member, MP and a member of the Scottish Affairs Committee. So the Scottish Affairs Committee are looking at an inquiry with a simple aim to better understand the issue of drug misuse in Scotland. And the session I attended, we took evidence from many experts who are also asking for radical change, experts like Professor Ian McPhee from the University of the West of Scotland. One of the things I think we do have challenges with is the fact that we can't just change the policies and do what we want. So I would ask the Minister to continue to lobby the UK government so that we can do things different, just like they have done in Portugal and in other countries across Europe since the 70s. So I will stop there, but I think this is worth further debate in the future. Thank you.
Neil Finlay, followed by Shona Robson.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank Monica Lennon for bringing forward this debate, but I think it says everything about the Government's approach to this national crisis, that we're only debating drug deaths in opposition time. Surely a non-debate about a citizens' assembly does not have a greater priority than discussing how we end our shameful accolade as the drugs death capital of Europe, or how we end the HIV outbreak amongst homeless drug injectors in Glasgow. You know the last time we debated drugs in government time in this Parliament? It was the 8th of November 2012, 7 years ago, when half the number of people were dying on the street. That is simply not good enough. And people say we have to have consensus over this. I disagree with that 100%. It's passive consensus that's got us to the situation we are at the moment, and we need anger and we need direction to government over this issue. That's what we need. Because the government's response has been pathetic. We had a 24% cut in the budget for alcohol and drugs partnerships in 2016, and I'm very pleased to see the former Cabinet Secretary here, and I hope she contributes to the debate, because she can explain why under her watch those very ADPs had that massive cut in their budget, resulting in poorer care, poorer attention for people who are going through addiction, and more people dying on the streets. A task force was set up. It hasn't met for the 6 months since it was announced. That exemplifies the problem. And we see a paltry £10 million over the next 2 years of additional funding. That exemplifies the ambivalence being shown. Let me put this into context. We're going to spend £1.4 million a month to keep a hospital in Edinburgh closed with no patients. We're going to spend an extra £76 million on an IT disaster to deliver farm payments. So we're spending £76 million on computers that didn't work, and we're spending millions on a hospital with no patients. But we're just spending a fraction of that, Minister, on our fellow citizens who are dying on the streets of this city and every other city and community every single day. And you know, if this was bird flu, if this was foot and mouth disease, or if it was a health threat to animals or another disease, there would be emergency meetings of the resilience division in the government. Resources would be freed up immediately. There would be a genuine emergency response. If any task force set up to deal with that hadn't met for 6 months, you would have been out the door a long time ago, Minister. But of course, it's only drug users. It's only people going through addiction, because politically they are easy to ignore. And to this government, they are miles down the list of priorities. Now, here's some of the suggestions that I have heard from people who are drugs users, people who have been supporting them, people who are in their families. They've said to me, stop jailing people who are unwell and need help, and treat them instead. They've said bring police, community and public health funding together to address the problems that people are facing. Set up mental health teams in police stations. This was the top ask from the police themselves when I went out on a shift with them over the summer. Allow drug users who have not responded to other forms of treatment to be prescribed heroin in a medical setting. Extend the application of naloxone. Have an early warning system for changes in behaviour on the streets. And stop cutting alcohol and drug partnership budgets and properly invest in mental health services, because the services that are there at the moment are completely and utterly swamped and inadequate. And people will talk warmly about the charities and voluntary organisations in their area. All of them have had their budget cut year on year on year. That's the reality. We should be extending the testing of ecstasy and other drugs. We should be taking action, long-term gradualist action against the prevalence of antidepressants so that people are not going on the streets to pick up counterfeit. We need a concerted and coordinated drugs service. And we need to stop discharging people from hospital onto the streets and address the homelessness crisis that we have. There's so much more I want to say, but please, let's not have any more guff about consensus. We need to get things fixed.
All parties, Greens aside, have had their first speakers go over time. I cannot allow anyone else to go over time because this chamber must resume again at the normal time on a Thursday. So Shona Robson, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start by welcoming Monica Lennon's debate and also the very powerful speech that she made at the outset. I also want to welcome the proposals set out by the Scottish Government in last week's statement on tackling drug-related deaths. Everyone in this chamber and those who are not in this chamber care deeply about this issue, whether it's in our communities or indeed having affected many of our friends and families. I echo the sentiment expressed by the Minister when he met the new chair of the Scottish Government's Drug Death Task Force, that the group needs to identify areas for change or improvement quickly rather than meet for months and then issue a final report. That is absolutely the right approach. The task force meets for the first time on the 17th of September. So in his response, can the Minister say if a timescale for output in relation to their remit has been discussed and agreed? I also understand that the task force will report to ministers and make recommendations for short, medium and long-term actions. Given the need to act now, will the Minister agree to allot time to provide regular updates of the progress of the task force, given the concerns shared by so many members across this chamber? In his statement, the Minister acknowledged the work of the Dundee Drugs Commission, who of course recently published its report responding to drug use with kindness, compassion and hope, which was presented by the Dundee Partnership. And I too would like to thank those involved in the report, especially those who have been directly affected, for the work that they've done in highlighting the issues faced in Dundee and across Scotland, and for their numerous recommendations, many of which have been acknowledged in the Scottish Government's own strategy documents. I was impressed when I met with some of the commissioners about how they are looking at very radical and different approaches, which is absolutely, again, the right course of action. One of the key recommendations in the report was the recommendation for the full integration of substance use and mental health services, something Miles Briggs touched on earlier, and support and its need in Dundee, particularly to join those services. They have been far too siloed, and the idea that someone cannot access services because potentially of an underlying mental health issue is not the right approach. We have to integrate those services. Trauma, violence, neglect and social inequalities lie at the root of both mental health problems and substance use problems, and we know the interlinking. And the idea, of course, that there is one simple solution to this, I don't think anyone would advocate that. There is, no thank you, I've only got 4 minutes. The idea that there is one simple solution to this is not something I think that is being suggested. We have to look at all of the potential solutions, some very radical, some that perhaps wouldn't have even been raised as a possibility 10 years ago in this place, but are now being discussed openly and have support across this chamber. It is absolutely the time for radical action, and we all need to look to that and be willing to open our eyes to that, and I certainly am one of those. Given the potential for such an approach and the need for urgent action, I'm pleased that the Minister is meeting with me later on to discuss the recommendations, particularly those about dual diagnosis, in more detail. And I would like, if he could, touch on how Dundee could be at the forefront of that implementation, because we do have complex issues in Dundee, and it is right that we look at a strategy that looks at the needs of particular locations, because there isn't one solution here for the whole of Scotland, and I would like the Minister to reflect on that in his closing remarks. Thank you.
Brian Whittle, followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also congratulate Monica Lennon for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and agree that it's about time we had significant government debating time for this topic. Can I start, Deputy Presiding Officer, for saying that for far too long, too many people in society haven't mattered. And it's just those, not just those who are caught in the web of addiction that are suffering. It's families, friends and local communities who have suffered the emotional fallout from addiction and the trauma of losing loved ones to addiction. Now I was introduced to a very uncomfortable phrase, and that phrase is, there is a hierarchy of death. The suggestion is that the way in which the bereaved are treated depends on how the deceased died. And they say that the bottom of that hierarchy are families and communities who have lost loved ones to addiction. And they are, of course, correct. So when we are discussing drug and alcohol deaths, let's make sure we do not forget the devastation that is left behind, no matter what is written on a death certificate. The pain and trauma left behind is the same, so we need to develop services accordingly. Now, I attended an event recently called A Matter of Life and Death Recovery in East Ayrshire, of which there was 110 stakeholders took place. And there were several presentations, including from the leader of the Government's Drug Death Task Force, Professor Katrina Matthews. Now, in the breakout sessions, I have to say that not one of the actions called for by those 110 stakeholders lies out with the competency of the Scottish Government. So when I reread the Minister's statement from last week on the Scotland's drug deaths, I was disappointed all over again. Now, I would not question the Minister's commitment and desire to tackle this issue, but it is blatantly obvious to me that the Scottish Government are going in the wrong road. They continually talk about the levers that they don't have and keep looking south to suggest that their hands are tied. And I have to say, I think you're hiding behind that excuse. And your options are being strangled by that narrow approach. Now, we do want safe spaces where further conversations can happen. And in East Ayrshire, they're trying to raise the cash, and it's not much in the scheme of things, to open a rehabilitation cafe, a safe space where medical interventions like hepatitis and AIDS testing can take place, where mental and physical health advice can be accessed, where dental health can be accessed. Now, these interventions are successful around the country, so we don't always need to reinvent a wheel. There are many people and organisations out there in the front line with lived experiences doing fantastic work. Much of the solution is about supporting and developing what is already working. The most effective tools we have at our disposal to tackle this crisis lie in education, health and the third sector, and the responsibility for which has been totally devolved to this Parliament for 20 years. And I have to say to this Chamber that successive governments' inability to create that legislation, investment and focus to this issue is an abject failure of this Parliament. And make no mistake, this Scottish Government has a significant toolbox to radically alter the approach to addiction and therefore the outcomes. And the one other thing I'm going to raise, it's something that was raised by Miles Briggs, is this: to regain control of any kind of addiction requires good mental health. We must stop the practice of withholding mental health treatment until an addict has stopped their habit, because many are self-medicating to mask the pain of previous trauma. So without that mental health intervention, there will be no way to mask the pain they seek to deaden. So in so many cases, a mental health intervention should be the initial starting point. Treat the cause, not the symptom. It was Hippocrates that said, better to know the person with the disease than know the disease that the person has. And I know I have to stop. There are so many things I would like to say, but again, thank you to Monica Lennon, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Before we move on to Sandra White, I still have a few members who wish to speak in the debate. So I'm minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. And I invite Monica Lennon to move that motion without notice.
Moved.
Thank you. Question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. That does not mean you have another 30 minutes, may I say. So even tighter, and I would ask remaining speakers to aim for 3.5 minutes. Sandra White, followed by Jenny Mara.
And can I thank Monica Lennon for securing this debate and for her very informed contribution, and welcome the people to the gallery. Presiding Officer, I represent part of Glasgow city centre, and unfortunately drug death is rife in that particular area. And having spoken to the professionals in Glasgow City Council, Greater Glasgow Health Board, it is obvious to everyone that a unified approach is needed. Yes, I think we need the drug consumption room, but I also think that's only one of the processes, and I would ask colleagues, in fact we have in this Parliament and the City Council and in Westminster, together said we would support the consumption room. So I would like that to happen also, but that is unfortunately in the wishes of the UK Parliament. But I don't want to get involved in the absolute politics of this altogether. This is about people. This is about real people, which we will see, and I certainly see every day in my constituency. If it's not in Glasgow City Centre or the Merchant City, it's in other areas of the constituency. And it's not just the fact that it's the drugs. It needs a holistic approach for what's causing the fact that people are, one, driven to take drugs in some aspects of it, and also the austerity aspects. You've also got the situation from Westminster, I must say that again, in regards to people not being able to live, can't afford to live, and people with mental health problems not being given anything at all, being sanctioned. It's all got to be looked at holistically. We've got to look at housing and health, and it is absolutely a public health matter. And I thank the Minister and others for recognising, I don't have time, sorry Jenny, for recognising the fact that it is a public health matter. So we can't just concentrate on one area, we've got to concentrate on all the areas. And I know I haven't much time, I want to give this part of the situation, the drug use, something that never gets covered at all. These people are called the train spotting generation. And during the 80s and 90s, a significant increase in the problem of drug taking in Edinburgh and in Glasgow and other cities also. Now, obviously we know about the film of Train Spotting, but it's not said enough that a lot of these people are dying. In fact, last year, more than 2/3 of drug-related deaths were aged between 35 and 54. And that's not just because of the drug that they were using, but because of the add-on, their age, they develop, multiple morbidity and respiratory diseases, etc. And we've got to recognise that also, but we want to prevent it getting to that. But I will repeat this figure again, more than 2/3 of drug-related deaths last year were aged between 35 and 54. And I don't think we should forget these people as well when we look at other aspects of drug death. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Jenny Mara, followed by Alison Johnson.
Presiding Officer, this morning the presenter on Reporting Scotland quoted the Scottish Government's reaction to drugs death. She said, "The power to reduce drugs deaths is reserved to Westminster." Simple, full stop, washing their hands of this, and not completely true. That's what she quoted the Scottish Government as saying this morning. But many more people watching their televisions this morning and all day today will hear that line of blame, many more than will hear the complexity of this debate in this chamber today and what the Scottish Government can actually do. My colleague Neil Finlay has listed about, I think, 16 things he told me that the Scottish Government can do. I think the list is endless on this, and I think the Minister appreciates that as well. Let me add, firstly, a couple of small points to that list. Minister, why don't we know locally how many drug users are receiving treatment? Because we know that treatment can save lives. In some European countries, 80% of problem drug users are in treatment. In England, they managed to treat 60%. Scotland, we manage 40%, less than half. But we don't even have the information to tell us how many people are in treatment in areas where we have particular problems. You and I don't know, despite the fact we represent Dundee and the area, what percentage of problem drug users are receiving treatment. Frankly, I think that is a disgrace. And my feeling on it, given all the other evidence I have seen, is that we in Dundee have an even lower treatment rate. But the government will not collect the information to allow us to discover that and allow us to plan those services for people properly. Now, the lack of data is a technical issue, but is an important issue, and it's one the Public Audit Committee has raised many times, and I hope the Minister will make a commitment today to start collecting this information so we can plan our drug services properly. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the Dundee Drugs Commission. It reported last month, and it made for grim reading. They said that drug services in Dundee, this is the NHS drug service in the city, was not fit for purpose. And I understand that an earlier draft had even proposed shutting down the NHS service altogether because it was failing so badly and starting again. The Commission, and I quote from the document, said that the service is entirely unaccountable, has no oversight, has been making maverick policy decisions without reference to best practice for years, and at times has willfully ignored national and regional policy on prescribing and drugs policy. There is almost no data, the Commission said, to understand the impact of the Dundee Drug Services action. And finally, the service itself refused to cooperate with the Commission, despite the fact it had the support of the Council, the NHS and all of us politically to do its work, and they blocked access to the information that was vitally needed by the Commission. Frankly, it's an utter disgrace, and I would like to hear the Minister's reaction to that too. The Dundee Drugs Commission did not take any evidence on safe consumption rooms. Now, the Minister knows that Scottish Labour have voted in this chamber to support the transfer of powers. But I believe there are some real issues we need to debate around the technicalities of this, the issues that Police Scotland have raised with me. Unfortunately, there isn't even time today, Presiding Officer, to raise these, and that's why I would urge the Minister again to have, I think, a week-long debate on this, but if he can't agree to that, then at least one. Presiding Officer, please let me say, I think this is a public health crisis. I think it is a human crisis. My fellow citizens, my age, mums and dads are dying in their droves. I think the Scottish Government owes it to them to at least debate this properly.
I have let you say it, Ms Mara, but it may affect your colleagues' time in speaking. And I call Alison Johnson to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too would like to thank Monica Lennon for bringing this debate to Parliament today. It truly is a national shame and scandal that so many have had their lives destroyed by drugs. Greens have always been clear that this is a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. It's now a public health emergency. When it comes to drugs, criminalisation has caused more harm than it can claim to have prevented. The war on drugs approach has clearly failed, and no wonder. Addiction is a complex illness, so it's clearly better tackled by trained medical professionals, not the courts. And we heard from contributors at today's meeting that we all need to take responsibility for this, and we all need to help Scotland to get better. Now, Portugal used to suffer from the kind of drug-related death rate and levels of HIV infection that Scotland is currently experiencing. The radical change in their law in 2001 decriminalised the use of all drugs, though not their production and supply, and subsequent years have seen dramatic drops in problematic drug use. in HIV and hepatitis infection too, in overdose deaths, in drug-related crime and in incarceration rates. So the success of this model clearly demonstrates that decriminalising possession while adopting a health-based approach to substance use problems can dramatically reduce drug deaths. I'm heartened we're discussing that model, and with a death due to drugs every 7 hours in Scotland, we need action and proper funding for that action. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights said on decriminalisation in Portugal that it was based on humanism, on courage, on participation and evidence. And in the face of this public health emergency, we need all of those. We support the introduction of safe consumption rooms. They've been operating in Europe for the last 30 years. It is disappointing that Westminster is being resistant to this potentially life-saving change. But it is clear that these rooms alone aren't a solution. Addiction as a root cause, not just addiction to a particular drug, needs to be addressed and treated. And we need to address the trauma that causes the addiction in the first place. So a trauma-informed workforce is key. And it's a really cruel paradox that as drug problems worsen, drug users become even more maligned. So we need to address the stigma that continues to surround drug users and treat addiction as an illness, not a personal failure. We need to respond to the emotional pain and the shame experienced by addicts and their families and friends. No one should ever be ashamed of being ill. In terms of treatment, we need intervention from our multidisciplinary health teams. We need the third sector. Pharmacists have got an important role to play too in intervening and reducing drug dependency. In the last 2 years, community pharmacists in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have saved 15 lives through the administration of naloxone to patients who have overdosed on opiates. This must be widely available. We've got to address the wider health and social inequalities that Sandra White mentioned. Health and social care is one aspect, but we need housing, we need employment support, we need financial advice, we need care for prisoners, we need care for people who are coming out of prison. People being left on their own when they leave prison, sometimes at a weekend, is simply unacceptable and just leads back into a circle of addiction. The Health and Sport Committee had an inquiry on this. We know what needs to be done. This issue really does affect people of all ages and stages. I want to make sure that we get the proper voices, the right people into the task force. We need that lived experience. We need the voices of families. We need to make sure that beds in rehab facilities aren't lying empty while people are desperate to access them. The Edinburgh Access practice in my region is doing a fabulous job. We need those non-judgmental services. You know, they need to be there when people need them. The workers in the access practice have told me they know which sofas to find the people they need to find on. In closing, Presiding Officer, I heard this morning from one contributor, if nothing changes, nothing changes. We need change now. Thank you.
Bob Doris, followed by James Kelly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to thank Monica Lennon for providing us with the opportunity to debate the self-evident public health emergency of drugs deaths in Scotland. Unity of purpose across government and opposition parties will be crucial. We look at solutions and the consequent funding that will be required. We must listen carefully to those with direct experience of drug use and addiction. It is their experiences that will base my comments this afternoon. My comments will be the thoughts of various individuals in my constituency, Maryhill and Springburn, with lived experience that I have met in recent times, many who have lost loved ones. When I met with constituents ahead of the drugs death vigil that was organised in George Square, the testimony I heard was challenging and harrowing, but cannot be ignored. And I met them again this morning at Monica Lennon's event. I also visited the Springburn Addictions Recovery Cafe to speak to several volunteers there. All of them have direct lived experience and have progressed through recovery. People are dying in my constituency, in Maryhill, in Possil, in Springburn, right across the constituency. It's not just a tragedy, of course it's a public health emergency. I was told stories of those pursuing recovery being refused lower doses of methadone by their GP, despite trying to move into recovery. I heard of those who suffered a relapse, but still committed to recovery, finding themselves placed on even higher doses of methadone when their GP found out, despite the fact that was higher than the methadone they were on before they sought recovery in the first place, something they didn't want. I've heard similar stories of constituents and their experiences with addiction workers, On occasions, addiction workers were actively discouraging individuals from moving into recovery or into abstinence-based programmes. It was unclear why. Some in the addictions field were doing so. Explanations offered to me by those with lived experience included it was cultural within addiction services. Not enough people have been through recovery were part of addiction services. Support pathways were weak or didn't exist or were not joined up. Addiction services were poorly resourced. Addiction workers had too many clients and didn't feel they give the individualised support that would be required. I want to stress that I heard good things about GPs and addiction workers also. I should put that on there. I just don't have time, Mr Finlay, I'm sorry. The Drugs Task Force will meet shortly. I welcome that, but it will be judged not by its meetings but by its actions, so the jury's obviously out on that. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the concerns that exist about the lack of lived experience in addictions and recovery on that. But I suggest that, yes, we need more direct representation on that, but I think we have to do something similar to what we did with the Social Security Scotland Bill, and that is we need an addiction and recovery experience panel, not meeting as a one-off, as a gimmick, but actually meeting regularly and feeding directly into the lived experience of those in recovery into the task force work on an ongoing basis. I hope that's something the government can agree to. And I also want to talk about Reverend Brian Casey in my constituency from Springburn Parish. I commend Brian for the love and support he sought to show those in recovery, but he's also in the last 5 years, 1/3 of all the funerals he's conducted has been drug-related deaths, and that's 1/3 of 500 funerals in Springburn. It's not acceptable. Something's got to change. What we're doing, self-evidently, is not working. Those families need policymakers and public agencies to act to try to stem this tide. Of course they do. A quick mention, Presiding Officer, street Valium is what's killing my constituents right now. We need a strategy directly for that as soon as possible also. But finally, we do need consensus, a new consensus, I have to say, and that consensus will have to come at budget time, when the unsavoury bun fighting between the parties must end, and we must decide the resource that's required in this place and the outcomes we want to drive. We must come together as a parliament.
The last of the open debate speakers is James Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank Monica Lennon for bringing this very important debate forward, and also congratulate the Daily Record for the campaign they have run to raise awareness of this national crisis. There's no doubt when you examine the statistics and you hear from the experiences of people, this is a really stark issue. One person a week in Scotland is murdered. 3 people die in road deaths. 15 people take their lives in suicide. But 22 people a week die from drugs deaths. That is absolutely stark and shows how serious the problem is. And I also have to say, back earlier in the year, we all gathered here to celebrate 20 years of the Scottish Parliament. And everybody made nice speeches and said what a great institution this was, but this particular area is a failure. It's a failure of devolution. It really is. You know, and we all have to take responsibility. The responsibility does start at the top. Back 10, 12 years ago, the government launched the Road to Recovery drug strategy. I supported that as an MSP at the time. I spoke at events and I spoke in the chamber, and we have to acknowledge that that has not worked. In that time, drugs deaths have more than doubled. So there's a real issue here, and there's a big challenge for us all as a parliament, but particularly for the government to do so much more. I think the government needs to be drawing in more expertise from people who internationally and also in Scotland who know more about these issues. I think we need to acknowledge that that expertise hasn't been drawn on in the last 10, 12 years. I also find it astonishing that the task force that's been set up has only got one person on it that's actually got lived experience of drug use and addiction. I think that's a real failing. I think what needs to happen is every spending priority and every policy needs to be tested against how it is going to assist in tackling this crisis. So, for example, During the summer, the government suspended through care in the prison service, and it's known that one of the areas that's really vulnerable is prisoners leaving prison and going into society, that they're in a vulnerable position, and some sadly succumb to drugs again and end up passing away. But the government, by suspending that through care service, is increasing the number of vulnerable people who are leaving prisons into society. And that happened during the summer, and even now we still don't have a date when that through care service is going to be reintroduced. What I would say, what I would appeal to the government is, you know, you need to do, you're listening to the speeches and even FMQs, the government are far too defensive. I agree and support the call in terms of consumption rooms, but that is such a small part of the debate. You need to interact so much more with the other parties and with the people in the gallery. You really need to up your game, because if the government fails to do that and we fail as a parliament, then people and communities will continue to suffer, and that will be totally unacceptable. We'd be letting them down as MSPs.
I now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to respond to the debate for no more than 7 minutes, please.
First of all, I want to thank Monica Lennon for securing the debate. Also thank her for organising the meeting this morning, and thanks to the folk in the audience who spoke this morning. It is unfortunate that the forum here doesn't allow your words to go on the record in the Scottish Parliament. Maybe that's one of the things that we need to think about, how we can make sure that happens, because I do genuinely absolutely value that voice of lived experience and family members is absolutely crucial. So thanks, Monica, for making that happen. The fact is the numbers of people who have died last year, are continuing to die and died in the previous years, is a tragedy. And it's important, I think, for us all to remember that it's not just that big number. Whatever that number was, every single person who has died is a personal tragedy for them, for their family, for their friends, and I think it's important we put it all in that context. But when we put it together, there is no question that this is an emergency. This is a public health emergency. I think one of the good things is that I'm seeing nodding from across the board in the chamber that this is a public health emergency, and that's important, because you would not get that consensus in all parts of our democratic system, because there are parts of the UK where this is not considered to be a public health issue. This is considered to be a justice issue, and that's one of the challenges that we have in taking this forward. The motion, just about everything in the motion I agree with, and there's one bit which, it's not that I don't agree with it, it's just that I can't do it. So the question about legally designating a crisis a public health emergency, if I had levers within my power, I can assure members in this chamber that I would absolutely use them to do that, and it's good to see that there's support across the chamber for that. Monica Lennon is absolutely correct in identifying the Civil Contingency Act 2004 as being the piece of legislation that would allow such an emergency to be enacted. But unfortunately, and I'm absolutely not wanting to make this any constitutional issue, unfortunately the specific powers to do that rest with the UK government. So, you know, if I can find any other ways within it, and I will continue to very quickly.
Monica Lennon.
Okay, I don't want to get into a legal argument right now, but is the Minister telling the Chamber that he cannot coordinate and liaise with and direct public bodies to do X, Y and Z, whatever that may be, because that is what we're looking for, an emergency response that we all know about, and report back to Parliament daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it takes, until we see lives being saved?
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Entirely different thing. So I don't have the powers to declare a legal emergency. That power rests with the UK government. Let's we all agree this is a public health emergency. So let's use the powers that are there. So let's call on our colleagues elsewhere to engage in this debate and make that happen, because it would be helpful, but it's not the only answer. In terms of getting agencies together, that is exactly what we need to do. And so I do not need to declare a public health emergency, I'll legally do that in order to take that forward. That is what we want to do. That's what the strategy that was launched last November is aimed at doing, and I was very pleased for the range of support for that strategy from not just across this Parliament, but from people who with lived experience and from other people who are working right across Scotland, because that's important. That we take that. I don't think I can, because there's been a number of really important points made, and the presiding officer will get on to me if I don't manage to get through as many of them as possible. She won't let me go on because she can't, because the Chamber has to come back. One of the points that Monica Lennon made that I think is very, very important was around stigma. I've spent a lot of time speaking to as many people as I can with lived experience and supporting people who are going through treatment, and stigma is absolutely one of the barriers. So part of that is for us to lead by example and try and be careful about our language as politicians, to respect people who are in treatment, and they shouldn't be somehow stigmatised in terms of whatever that treatment is. And I know there's a bit of debate about whether this treatment or that treatment, whatever treatment is deemed appropriate for someone to move as part of their treatment or recovery, then it is absolutely crucial that they are supported in that, in the round. One of the points that Bob Doris, Jenny Mara and I think other folk made was around what people's experiences are with that treatment, and I think that's one of the things that I've also heard from people with lived experience, and particularly I've had constituents who've come to me seeking support about how they can get the treatment they want, whether it's methadone or other forms of support, and the experience has not been what it should be. That's why it was really good that the Dundee Drugs Commission was so frank and so clear and gives some clear directions, but there's points in there for the whole of Scotland. So that's why in the programme for government we've included a commitment to developing a national pathway, so that that best practice around treatment we can make sure that's right across Scotland. I've heard the calls around respite as well, and people saying that they aren't having the choice. I don't personally feel that we should be putting one form of treatment above others. It needs to be what works for the individual, and what we need to understand is that given the level of complexity and the driving factors behind much of the addiction that a number of members had talked about, Shona Robertson and John Mason in particular talked about, often it's some severe trauma has happened in someone's life that has been part of the process. So we need to be as supportive as we can be in taking that forward. Shona Robertson also mentioned the Dundee Drugs Commission in relation to their recommendation around mental health, and I think she is absolutely right that this is something that has been highlighted as a particular problem in Dundee. But again, I've spoken to people across the country, people who are in treatment, who are seeking treatment, and they're finding a barrier because they have a dual diagnosis. And it's not always just mental health and something else. We need to treat the person, we need to support the person. So that's why the announcement in the programme for government was there in relation to that dual diagnosis mental health, and I'll be pleased to have a further discussion with Shona Robertson about that after. I'm conscious of time is difficult, so there's a few points that I think I really want to make sure I'm covering. So in terms of...
The Minister's just closing, Ms Mara.
James Kelly made, I think, a really important point which hasn't really been discussed. I was equally concerned when I heard about the decision around the through care, and I'm really keen to make sure that we get some alternative support in there. Probably the support that was there before wasn't ideal, because I think from what I've been hearing is if that through care support was provided by people with peer experience, that might be far more useful in terms of taking people out. It's an area of vulnerability. The point that Alison Johnson made, most of the people we're talking about shouldn't be in prison anyway, and so we shouldn't be having to have that. But while we still have people in prison and coming out of prison, it's a crucial part of the jigsaw. In relation to the drug death task force, I'm happy to engage further with members. I think it will be absolutely crucial that the task force is able to hear from the widest range of lived experience. I know Professor Matheson is considering how she can do that, but I absolutely hear the points that it is absolutely important that that is heard. I've tried to get people in the room around that task force who will not just be talking, but they'll be the ones that hear that lived experience and then have to go and make things happen, because we need action. I get the point about there's been a lot of talking, and I hear people wanting more discussions, and that's fine. We'll have further debates, but it is important that we look at how we can take this forward in action. I thank the members for the way that they've taken this forward in debate, because I think there is something we can make a difference here, but it will be easier for us to make a real difference if we work together. So thank you.
That concludes the debate, and this meeting is suspended until 2:30.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today, and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women, and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.